Hi, everyone. In this video, in which I'll discuss a small section of text from the introduction to Annie Proulx's 1997 short story, Brokeback Mountain, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the process that I go through when I do a close reading of a text. I'm going to begin by noticing a detail in the introduction of the text here. I'm then going to hypothesize some possible ways of explaining that detail. That is, why might Annie Proulx have included this particular description at this particular moment of the text? I'm then going to look through the text for any patterns that might shed more light on the significance of this detail and other details like it in the text as a whole. Where this is going to leave us is not with a thesis for a paper, but with a lot of material that could be developed into a really excellent reading of this text. That is, a lot of material that needs some sort of argumentative explanation. I'll start off by reading the section on the screen. Ennis Del Mar wakes before 5, wind rocking the trailer, hissing in around the aluminum door and window frames. The shirts hanging on a nail shudder slightly in the draft. He gets up, scratching the gray wedge of belly and pubic hair, shuffles to the gas burner, pours leftover coffee in a chipped enamel pan. The flame swathes it in blue. He turns on the tap and urinates in the sink, pulls on his shirt and jeans, his worn boots, stamping the heel against the floor to get them full on. The wind booms down the curved length of the trailer, and under its roaring passage he could hear the scratching of fine gravel and sand. It could be bad on the highway with a horse trailer. He has to be packed and away from the place that morning. Again, the ranch is on the market, and they've shipped out the last of the horses, paid everybody off the day before, the owner saying, "Give 'em to the real estate shark. I'm out of here," dropping the keys in Ennis's hand. He might have to stay with his married daughter until he picks up another job, yet he is suffused with a sense of pleasure because Jack Twist was in his dream. The stale coffee is boiling up, but he catches it before it goes over the side, pours it into a stained cup and blows on the black liquid, lets a panel of the dream slide forward. If he does not force his attention on it, it might stoke the day, rewarm that old cold time on the mountain when they owned the world and nothing seemed wrong. The wind strikes the trailer like a loaded dirt coming off a dump truck, eases, dies, leaves a temporary silence. Now, there's a lot that we could potentially talk about in this section. The wind suggests itself by being present both in the first sentence and in the last sentence. But I've chosen not to talk about the wind. And what that means for me, if this is the beginning of a paper that I'm writing, is that I don't have to talk about the wind until it becomes relevant to my argument, which maybe it won't ever do. Instead, what I'm interested in here is just the coffee. Now, I don't know that I would write a full paper about coffee in Brokeback Mountain, although potentially I could. But at this point, I just want to know why Annie Proulx put this stale coffee at the beginning of her story. So the first question I have is, well, what does stale coffee tell us about Ennis Del Mar? We see over here in the beginning of the first paragraph that the coffee is left over and that it's being poured into a chipped enamel pan. Now, what does that mean? Well, this is not my first reading of the story, so I know for a fact that Ennis is not very well off economically. So it could be that the leftover coffee is his way of saving a little bit of money. He doesn't want to waste coffee that he's already made. But when you think about leftover coffee, there's sort of an absence of, not only an absence of luxury, but it might suggest that Ennis isn't taking necessarily great care of himself. He's saving his coffee, but the coffee's lost a lot of its flavor. As we see in the second paragraph, the coffee is stale, and the pan itself isn't doing that well. It's a chipped enamel pan. So we have this stale coffee, and we see it boiling up, threatening to boil over the edge of the pan to get his stove all dirty. but he stops it. He catches it before it goes over the side. Now, knowing what we do about Ennis, that he's a character who is in a very meaningful gay relationship with Jack Twist, but who has spent the majority of his life repressing that relationship, we might read some symbolic significance or resonance into the idea of stale coffee boiling up and Ennis catching it before it boils over, before it goes over the side. Coffee is something that excites. It's not necessary for sustenance. It's not exactly food, but it's something that's exciting that also threatens to make things messy. You can see the parallels possibly developing here between Ennis's coffee and Ennis's relationship with Jack. I would argue that Annie Proulx makes this parallel much more explicitly in the second sentence of this second paragraph here. When we move from the stale coffee boiling up and Ennis catching it before it goes over the side to the panel of a dream sliding forward, and then finally, if he does not force his attention on it, that being the dream, it might stoke the day, rewarm that old cold time on the mountain when they owned the world and nothing seemed wrong. Notice the parallel here between rewarming that old cold time on the mountain and rewarming the coffee. We might argue that Annie Proulx is creating an analogy here between the way Ennis drinks his stale coffee, what he's doing when he rewarms his stale coffee, how sad that might seem to us, seeing a man rewarming coffee and pouring it into a chipped enamel pan, all that might suggest about his character and his situation in life, and what it might suggest more broadly about the way that he's rewarming the desire that he ultimately wasn't able to realize in a long-term way in his relationship with Jack. Now, at this point, I think, okay, well, this is interesting. Proulx is drawing, I think, to me, quite conclusively, some sort of a relationship or a symbolic connection between stale coffee, excitement that's lost its savor, but that's still there to be called upon as necessary, and the relationship itself. What I want to do now is go through the rest of the story and see if there are any other parallels to this coffee. The first thing that comes to mind for me, or that came to mind when I was preparing for this video, was actually the very end of the story. Here, and the reason this came to mind is because we return here to the same dream that we saw at the very beginning. This is the second to last paragraph, but the last sort of section of the story. Around that time, and this is shortly after Jack's death, Jack began to appear in his dreams. Jack, as he had first seen him, curly-headed and smiling and buck-toothed, talking about getting up off his pockets and into the control zone. But the can of beans with a spoon handle jutting out and balanced on the log was there as well, in a cartoon shape and lurid colors that gave the dreams a flavor of comic obscenity. The spoon handle was the kind that could be used as a tire iron. And he would wake sometimes in grief, sometimes with the old sense of joy and release, the pillow sometimes wet, sometimes the sheets. Now, I want to point out a couple of things here. One is the obvious parallel between the spoon handle and the tire iron being the symbol of homophobic violence that regulates Ennis's conduct in particular in this story, and that seems to define the social understanding of homosexuality in Wyoming during this time period in the context of this story. There's also the use of the word flavor here to talk about the way that the beans make the dreams feel, right? They gave the dreams a flavor of comic obscenity. Again, since the dreams are where, after Jack's death, Ennis's erotic imagination seems to realize itself, the fact that it's being described as having a flavor of comic obscenity may be important. Since I notice a parallel between the description of the dream at the beginning of the story and the dream at the end, and I'm noticing here that both of them also seem to have some important relationship to food or consumption, or in one way or another, my next step is to just go through the rest of the story and look to see if there are other discussions of food or dining that might come together with descriptions of Ennis's relationship with Jack. One of the reasons that this seems significant to me as a symbol is in part because food and shared meals seem crucial to the way that we think about making a home with someone, about domesticity in a more general sense. And one of the main conflicts in the story, just on the level of plot, is between Jack, who encourages Ennis to imagine what it would be like for them to build a home together, and who argues with him that is possible, and Ennis, who absolutely refuses this, and perhaps as a result lives a life of wandering and unfulfillment. So as I go through the rest of the story fairly quickly here, I'll just point to a number of other places where if I were developing this into a paper, I would note these and begin annotating like crazy. And I'm working backwards because I happen to have gone to the end and then flipped back through the pages. So here is Ennis visiting with Jack's father. Jack's mother, stout and careful in her movements as though recovering from an operation, said, "Want some coffee, don't you? Piece of cherry cake?" "Thank you, ma'am. I'll take a cup of coffee, but I can't eat no cake just now." So again, we have coffee, we have eating here. This might be more significant in a reading that I would develop of this story. Here's something on page 22 that seems like it would play a big role in the paper that I would write about this story. The idea that that what Jack and Ennis share is, for Jack, some shared and sexless hunger. A shared and sexless hunger here is talking about those elements of their relationship that aren't only about sexual intimacy, but the word hunger suggests that the way the story is dealing with the meals that they share or don't share might be important. As I continue to go back through, I see on page 16 another moment that seems to center a little bit around food. This is the idea that Ennis is a fisherman who never catches any fish, right? He goes out to get something, but he never brings back anything for his family to eat. Noteworthy also is the fact that this conversation is taking place just after some pie, after a dinner at the house that Ennis is attending on Thanksgiving at the house of Alma and her new husband. You might also notice towards the end of this scene that eating seems to come in again. That's here where Ennis says, "I'll make him eat the fucking floor, and you too." And then finally, as I continue to go back through this story, the other scene that I would almost certainly talk about at length in a paper would be this scene in which Jack and Ennis finally meet again after 4 years being apart, and Alma suggests that they all go out for dinner together to the Knife and Fork, a restaurant that's named explicitly for the utensils that signify a sort of settledness and normalcy surrounding eating. The knife and fork are very different from a dirty spoon, but the relationship between Jack and Ennis is not a knife and fork relationship. Ennis said more likely he'd just go out with Jack and get drunk. Jack was not a restaurant type, he said, thinking of the dirty spoons sticking out of the cans of cold beans balanced on the log. So here, this as a reader gets me very excited. The idea that Jack is not a restaurant type. What does it mean to be a restaurant type? What does that signify in terms of how their relationship fits in or fails to fit in with the other patterns of sexual relationship and emotional partnership that, say, Alma and Ennis's relationship represents. The dirty spoons sticking out of cans of cold beans balanced on a log seem here to suggest a different kind of community, a different kind of eating, but also a kind of precariousness. The beans are balanced on the log. They're not on the table. They may fall. And following this, I would want to go back to the scene where they actually eat those beans, which happens just a couple of pages earlier. And here we see that, in fact, the beans appear just before their first sexual encounter. They had a high time supper by the fire, a can of beans each, fried potatoes and a quart of whiskey on shares, sat with their backs against a log, boot soles and copper jeans rivets hot, swapping the bottle while the lavender sky emptied of color and the chill air drained down, drinking, smoking cigarettes, etc., etc. So if I were thinking about, okay, let's make a thesis out of this, I would think about perhaps the magic thesis statement. By looking at blank, we can see blank, which most readers don't notice. This is important because blank. I think I have my first blank filled in here. By looking at scenes of eating, or by looking at the way Annie Proulx sets up Jack and Ennis's cans of beans against other more elaborate meals, we can see something about their relationship, which I would then have to analyze to figure out exactly what it was, which is important because, well, that would depend on the argument that I'm making. So again, I haven't arrived at an argument here. This isn't a paper. This is just the beginning of a paper, but what I have found is that I think I could write a pretty awesome paper that tries to bring these different sections of the text together and make some serious sense of them. I hope this is helpful to you. We'll talk about it more in class on Thursday. Until then, have a good Wednesday and enjoy the movie.